Alright, so in this lecture I'm going to review a few different studies about love, dating, and sex in emerging adulthood. There are 3 types of dating goals, and this study in particular looked at late adolescents and emerging adults. And they were looking at individuals who are attracted to opposite and same-sex youth. But the 3 basic ways that they kind of broke down dating goals. Identity goals had to do with dating because of concerns for self-understanding, so trying to identify who they are. In contrast, intimacy goals have to do with maintaining and developing exclusive and committed and close relationship with one partner. And then finally, status goals have to do with affiliative status, looking for social validation. This is normally kind of the lowest level of dating goals. You often see this in middle or high school in particular. What we find in emerging adulthood is increasingly more identity and intimacy goals compared to status goals. And so intimacy happens particularly frequently in emerging adulthood, and particularly in those currently dating someone. Women are more likely than men to have identity goals. And we don't see any differences in the dating goals of same versus other sex-attracted youth. So there don't seem to be differences in terms of sexuality, but there are definitely age differences. This is obviously not literature, but this really shows the potential for ambiguity in emerging adult romantic relationships. And there's a lot of relatively new variations in sexual relationships. So you have things like hookups, where you have sex without emotional intimacy. You've got friends with benefits, where you have sex in the context of friendships without any plans for future romantic relationships. There are also things like in your readings, living apart together, where you identify as a couple, but you have no plans for cohabitation or marriage, and there might be variability in how much you see each other. So these ambiguities can cause some stress for emerging adults. This study looked at the consequences of sex on mental and social well-being in emerging adulthood, and in particular they looked at first-year college students who had engaged in sexual intercourse, and because this is a particularly important time for sexual development. And so these are intrapersonal consequences, so consequences to themselves. So positive consequences include things like physical satisfaction, feeling better, feeling attractive about oneself. Negative intrapersonal consequences include worry about pregnancy, exposure to STDs, regrets, things like that. Generally, you find that these emerging adults have experienced more positive consequences than negative consequences. And another kind of category of consequences they looked at was interpersonal consequences, so relationship consequences. So positive would be things like feelings of intimacy, enhanced reputation, things like that, whereas negative interpersonal consequences would be worrying about whether or not the partner wants commitment, feeling like things are moving too fast, things like that. And what they identified was that in most cases, positive consequences were much more frequent than negative consequences. So 96% of emerging adults report positive consequences, while 54% report negative consequences. The most common intrapersonal consequences were feeling physically satisfied and worrying about pregnancy, whereas the most common interpersonal consequences were intimacy and worrying that the partner wanted more commitment. And overall, there were few gender differences. So there were no differences in positive intrapersonal consequences. Men were more likely to worry about health consequences, but less likely to feel dissatisfied. And there were no gender differences at all in the interpersonal consequences. And there were just as many positive consequences whether they were dating or not dating their partner, although when they engaged in sexual intercourse with a non-dating partner, they were more likely to feel guilty and feel like they hadn't been ready for sex. And not using contraception and sex with a non-dating partner predicted more negative consequences, as you'd kind of expect. The more riskier sexual interactions lead to more negative consequences. So that's just kind of a snapshot of how emerging adults are feeling in terms of sexual interactions, at least in early college. Okay, next is just kind of a theoretical orientation to how we think about love in particular. So here we're looking at relationships, and this is what you'll use for your assignment. So there's 3 basic components of love according to Sternberg's triangular theory of love. The first is intimacy, and this has to do with attachment, closeness, connectedness, bondedness, really sharing intimate and personal details. Commitment has to do with short-term decisions to remain together, as well as long-term decisions to share achievement and make plans together. So really seeing yourself together in the future. And then the final component is passion, which has to do with that romantic attraction, that spark, the desire to have the other attracted to you and to feel attracted to the other, and sexual attraction goes in this as well. So the 3 components of love are intimacy, commitment, and passion. And Sternberg basically argued that based on those 3 types of love, we can actually come up with 3 components, we can come up with several different types. So non-love doesn't have any of these characteristics. Liking, which is best associated with friendship, is not trivial. There's a lot of closeness, but that closeness doesn't have passion and it doesn't have long-term commitment. So you're sharing intimacy, but you're not making long-term plans together, and there's not that passionate spark. Infatuation is all passion, but none of the other 2 components. So it's passionate arousal without any intimacy, without commitment. It could disappear suddenly. It often starts suddenly and could disappear suddenly. And then empty love is commitment without intimacy and passion. So this could be something as formal as an arranged marriage. It could develop into more, but it really is just about the commitment without intimacy and passion. And then we have some various combinations. So romantic love, for example, has physical and emotional attachments, but not necessarily a sustained commitment. So there's a lot of emotional sharing, there's that passion, but they haven't made any kind of long-term commitment. Companionate love is stronger than friendship because it has the intimacy component of friendship, but it also has some kind of commitment. You often see this in kind of long-term marriages where there's not a lot of passion anymore, but they're clearly on this trajectory together, or family members, or really strong friendships where they may have this commitment made clear. And then fatuous love is passion and commitment. So here you might see a whirlwind dating or marriage. Commitment is often based on passion without the intimacy. So I'm very attracted to you, so I'm going to make this long-term commitment, even if we haven't really shared our thoughts and feelings a whole lot. And then ideally, consummate love is kind of complete or ideal love. These are people who are having great sex 15 years into their relationship. They can't imagine anyone else. They're very happy with their relationship. They're committed to each other. They're emotionally intimate, and they're also still passionate. So you'll use this for your discussion forum assignment. Okay, next, one of your reading talks about cohabitation, so I'm not going to review it a ton, but cohabitation is when unmarried people are living together in an intimate relationship on a long-term or permanent basis. Now, historically, cohabitation has actually been related to increased likelihood of divorce. Now that's less and less true. What we're finding is that cohabitation is becoming more common, and so it seems to be particularly not problematic if their cohabitation, or if they're cohabitating kind of as part of a long-term relationship or after they're engaged or things like that. So historically, cohabitation has been associated with breaking taboos, and it might be people on kind of extreme ends of the spectrum, potentially impulsive people, and since we're seeing it becoming more and more the norm, they seem to be less and less the outliers. Typically, people who are cohabitating are college educated, and they do it in the context of a committed relationship. They're seeing it as a test run for marriage. group that we do see as problematic is those who we call serial cohabitators. These tend to be less educated and less financially stable, and basically what they are doing is getting into a series of cohabitation relationships that aren't leading to marriage. So these might be unplanned. They might be something like they're on a person's lease, their lease is running out, and so they move in with their romantic partner, not necessarily because it's the right time in their relationship, but just because financially it makes sense. This was from a study that was looking at sexual experiences and couple formation attitudes among emerging adults, and this is just underscoring this change in norms about cohabitation and sexual activity. And so previous literature, old literature, has shown that premarital sex is as a risk factor for later divorce. And the question is really, does sexual activity predict attitudes about marriage and cohabitation? Is sexual activity the reason we see this association, or we have seen this association with divorce? So these are college students who are age 18 to 21 who are currently not cohabitating. What we find is that sexually active adults say that marriage is an important goal. And so those who are sexually active are valuing marriage, in fact, more than those who are not sexually active. And sexually active emerging adults are also more likely to have positive attitudes towards cohabitation. And there was this particularly interesting interaction with religiosity, which is basically emerging adults who are more religious value marriage more highly and also have more negative cohabitation attitudes. But sexual activity had a bigger impact on religious emerging adults. So people who were low on religion were equally likely to endorse cohabitation if they were planning to marry, whether they were sexually active or not. People who were highly religious and also sexually active were much more likely to accept cohabitation than those who were highly religious and not sexually active. And dating did not change individuals' attitudes about cohabitation, but it did lead to stronger and more positive attitudes about marriage. And generally what it seems like emerging adults who were sexually active were in long-term relationships, and this led to more positive feelings about cohabitation. So what seems like is happening now is that cohabitation is the next logical steps in relationships. And then this is looking at personal relationship influences and thinking about personal motives. So this study interviewed 20 couples who had been dating for more than 2 months and less than 3 years. They were 19 to 35. In terms of deciding whether or not to cohabitate, when couples disagree, one person's desire not to live together trumps another person's desire to live together. And they report that cohabitation is very relationship specific. So they might cohabitate with one partner and refuse to with the next. Family also plays a big role in terms of parental advice and social modeling and religious beliefs. There's fear that the cohabitation will lead to breakups, and this can lead to kind of awareness of the vulnerability of marriage. Just to give you an example, I had friends in graduate school, they were roommates, and they each decided to move in with their boyfriend, but their parents disapproved, and so they actually told their parents that the boys were living together, when in fact they were living with their boyfriends, just to avoid the parental disapproval. So there's great lengths people go through to avoid this parental disapproval. And peers can be seen as kind of vicarious trials, so looking at how other couples did can be used to evaluate whether they want to attempt cohabitation. This happens on occasion, although often people see their own situations as unique, so don't generalize. And that is all I have to add.